Welcome back to our Canon Hour, in which we're sharing a conversation with Canon Tynes, looking at the whole question of education and ministry, the need to educate our members, both ordained and non-ordained, if they are to engage in ministry more effectively. There is no doubt in most people's mind that the ordained are in ministry, but many churches don't emphasize the fact that the unordained are also charged with ministry, and people in that group see ministry as something that's done by other people, and they in a sense are spectators, not participants in the because ministry in the New Testament is first and foremost the ministry of the church.
That's right.
It is the collective, and we who belong, both ordained and non-ordained, we participate in that ministry. So I just wondered whether we can spend a minute just talking in terms of how does the church equip both groups, both ordained and non-ordained, to appreciate how we got to this point. If we looked at the message of the Bible is that God is the source of everything, the source of creation. And he is used, Abraham becomes the father of faith, as Paul says, both in Romans 4 and in Galatians 4, that it really is the salvation begins with him. But God is active to undo the harm done by man's sin and man's rebellion. But from Abraham onwards, we see God at work using a particular group, the Hebrew people, as his chosen people, and we see that they are commissioned to really be God's representatives in the world, and to not only to be faithful to him in their context, but also to be the light to the whole world. They were selected to work on behalf of God for the whole world,
right,
to be the light to the Gentiles, etc.
And Song of Simeon.
And so, but the whole of the Old Testament tells us with the ministries of the prophets and the wise men that Israel failed in that mission. And that point is emphasized in Romans chapter 2, that Israel failed in
That's
its.
right.
But so God comes, and so Paul says in Galatians, in the fullness of time,
God sent
God
his
sent
son.
Son born of a woman, that God comes in Jesus to undo the work of the harm and to recreate the new people of God that are brought into being with the resurrection. And then from the resurrection onwards, we have this group of persons sent out by Jesus, commissioned and empowered by his Spirit to take the message and to go across the whole world. Now, and that started in Palestine, in a small portion of Palestine, and then it grows outwards. So in Acts 1:8 we have the whole question of, he says, when the Spirit comes, you will receive power. You start in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. So from that point, the movement, the Christian movement, spreads outwards. Now, I think a lot of people are unaware of the fact that when this movement spread outward, it first of all had to contend with the Greek world, all the irreligion and the paganism of the Greek world.
Yes, sir.
To understand why they had to sit down and write epistles, why they had to then write treatises, why the councils had to be called, because of the world in which they were living, where there were so many gods and so many isms going on, and the church had to take our message and stand up against. And so when we talk about church history, we're talking about how the whole faith expands and the context in which it expanded, and how the church attempted to carry this message in different cultures and through different periods up to our own time.
And I think we spend a whole lot of time talking about its spread through Asia Minor and down to Rome and then on to Spain. But we need to realize that the real strength, as far as I'm concerned, comes from Northern Africa, where you had Carthage, which was one of the great theological centers. You had Alexandria, where there was quite a bit of work going on. And so we see the church spreading throughout both North and South Mediterranean areas as the message went forth. You know, I'm always amused by people who believe that it's only the Europeans who were interested in Christianity. The people in Africa were very much instrumental in terms of Northern Africa of
yes, and
carrying the banner for Christianity
and
in terms of church history.
Augustine was one of
Yes.
one of the greatest theologians
Mhm.
of the whole history of Christianity.
That's right.
And he was from North Africa. And then you had
Saint
the whole
Athanasius,
Athanasius and the whole
Basil the
movement
Great.
all around Caesarea
Yep.
and that area. That it has a
Mhm.
rich history. But I still think that we need to help both ordained and unordained to appreciate this long process of God using persons to take this message and how it had to react in different contexts. So you would have Paul writing to the Romans quite differently from how he wrote to Galatians.
Exactly.
And then you have the letter to the Hebrews carrying the same message but in a totally different way.
altogether.
Then you have the Johannine letters, which are
Mhm.
taking the same message but carrying in a different, using different categories, but all doing the same thing. And the multiplicity of it is not only beautiful and wonderful, but it is quite enriching, and it
For-
is so helpful to bring people to the point that they can appreciate the scope and the magnitude. But
I agree.
what do you think we are doing in terms of
I think one of the things that
presenting that?
happens is that people do not realize that we need to recognize the fact that God deals with sacred places, sacred people, sacred things. And there is a development that takes place in the pages of the New Testament. Paul's epistles give way to some of the other later writings of the New Testament, right down to the revelation of St. John the Divine. And we have to make sure that people understand that there is a development that is taking place. I often have to say to people that we have to remember that the scriptures took almost 330 plus years for them to finally make a decision on what books would make it into our Bibles and which ones would not. And we need to recognize that part of that process is that the creeds came first before the actual canon of our scriptures. And you need to know something of that period, because without understanding what are the basic doctrines that is presented by the New Testament. You know, I've heard people say, oh, all you need is a grade 8 education. That's not so. There is a whole lot there that needs to be done in terms of training not only clergy persons, so that they're able to appreciate and understand the developmental process that goes from the New Testament up to the actual canon itself of the scriptures. But it's important for them to be able to share that with the laity so that they're able to answer questions in this day and in this age.
And to help the laity to appreciate what has happened, how we got from there. Say, how you get from Jerusalem and Peter and the first apostles, how the journey that they started, how it leads us to the church as we know it.
And for them to also recognize the fact that there were various centers of Christianity around that particular region. It wasn't just one particular place. I mean, you had Alexander, you had Cappadocia, you had Carthage, you had quite a number of other places where the church was extremely strong in terms of being centers of Christianity.
And what the church did, which I think we haven't done as good a job, and certainly in the third and fourth centuries in the early church, there was this tremendous emphasis on the catechesis.
Exactly.
That the teaching, and that really was ongoing, and everyone was subjected to it. There were no exceptions.
And those who were preparing for baptism, Bishop, if you look back at the records, for 2 and 3 years, they literally stopped work. They went to the classes. They were carried through various forms of exorcism, and then finally presented on Holy Saturday on the vigil
For-
in order to be baptized and confirmed.
to celebrate Easter.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And I think we need to recognize the fact that the church put in a great deal of energy in terms of carrying out that teaching ministry.
But our problem about that is that we have the content in terms of the faith that has come down, but the mechanisms for doing that, it seems to me, are different in our time. Because, well, for one thing, most of our members will say they're so busy. They're busy. Some working, some doing this, that, and the other, but they're all so occupied that even when they claim that they have the interest, they don't seem to have the time and a sufficient amount of time to really devote themselves to really engaging the faith as they should.
I sometimes I believe, Bishop, we use that as a cop-out for not really educating and retooling our own selves for ministry. And I'm not talking about the ordained, but also for the laity as well. We find time for everything else. Time for our favorite shows, time for us to go to our social clubs, time for us to go to sports. I think what is important is that our people, we need to be able to use other means of getting that message across. One of the things that we've been trying to do is use the internet and emails so that we can send out the biblical teaching week by week as we make our way through the Walk Through the Bible program. And I think it's important that if people cannot make it for legitimate reasons, that we as a church have to make sure that we reach out to try and bring as many of them to where they need to be in their journey. I had a rector who used to say to us over and over again, true belief leads to right conduct.
Yeah.
And if we don't get...
It's orthodoxy and orthopraxis.
Exactly. And so without that, we're going to continue to falter along the way in terms of our own understanding and our journey as God's people.
We'll take our second break, and then on our return, I would want us to look at the internet and to look at the positives and negatives of a mechanism that the church can use.